I'll be talking on revising textbooks, when and how. I'll begin with a statement that certain kinds of revision of textbooks, are desirable, they are generative, they are productive. There are other kinds of revisions which I think are undesirable and they're regressive and problematic. The experiments and the kind of textbooks that Romila talked of, or the kind of textbook reworkings that many of us were involved in,
This one.
Yeah. I was saying that certain kinds of revisions of textbooks are desirable, they're productive, and they're generative. They inspire new ways of thinking and help students understand the world in more creative ways. There are other kinds of changes in textbooks, revisions of textbooks, which I think of as undesirable and regressive. This is an argument I'll try to map through 2 or 3 kinds of shifts that I'll talk about within textbook writing in history. Before I talk about textbooks, a few general comments about revision of history in general. Knowledge, one would argue, and it's generally agreed upon now, usually develops through shift of frameworks of thought. But changes in our ways of understanding, our ways of seeing, looking at the world and the past. It develops through a critique of earlier ways of looking, of seeing, the earlier questions, the earlier types of questions which were posed, and the kinds of frameworks and structures through which history was analyzed. When revision takes place, you ask new questions. You critique the existing questions and you ask new types of questions. You engage with the literature within the field, the wider literature, not simply in the field of history, but you engage with the literature in other social sciences, humanities, literature, art, etc. And you draw upon the resources of the intellectual field to develop your arguments and ideas, and you talk about new ways of thinking, drawing upon this intellectual resources of that particular time. So when intellectual resources change, there is a demand then for a revision of knowledge, of revision of history, revision of knowledge in general. So you offer a new way of looking at the past very often through these revisions by displacing earlier frameworks of thought. But you also revise very often in order to nuance earlier frameworks of thought. You are operating within the same kind of framework, but you are making it richer, you are making it more complex, you are nuancing ideas which have been developed, but you've researched much more, found more material, rethought your argument, and you're deepening the framework of thought. So these are slightly 2 different kinds of ways of revising, but both are generative, important, and lead to a new kind of way of looking at the past and history. The examples of this kind of revision is something which we have already had. Romila talked of the shift from the colonial to the national in the early 20th century, and then how that nationalist frame is actually deepened by the 1950s and 60s when Romila, Bipin, Irfan Habib, R.S. Sharma and all of them are writing, and they are writing not just histories, they are also writing textbooks. So colonial history is colonial because it legitimates colonial power. It is colonial because in many different ways it looks at colonial power as necessary, normal, required, and it validates colonial power. If you are talking about history, we find that the Orientalists, that is the late 18th century, Orientalist historians and scholars glorified ancient India, but then saw a secular decline through the Muslim period till the 18th century, when British rule, and they projected British rule as a rule which will actually lead again to the development of the country. So there is a glorification of ancient India. The medieval period is seen as a dark age, and that dark age will lead to a new time of enlightenment under British rule. In the earlier period, there was no change. In the earlier period, in the medieval period, particularly in the 1830s and 40s, when Macaulay and Mill started writing, which Romila referred to, a new kind of history emerges. When you don't see the ancient periods any longer as glorious, you see the pre-British periods as frighteningly and uniformly dark. This was a period when there was no change within society. It was a period which had no history as such. There was no growth, no development. It was a period when there was no law and order. One despotic dynasty replaced another despotic dynasty. So it is a history of despotism which reproduced itself through time, and it is under British rule. Macaulay, Mill and others suggested it is under British rule that law and governance will be established, a new civilization will come, education will spread, science and technology will spread, and a new time, a new future will be established. So India would be civilized, and the British will bring history to the nation. A nation which lacked history will now have history, and British began writing that history and showed what history writing is all about. The nationalists, when they came in, critiqued this framework, which Romila talked of, and they showed, and this particularly is there in the Marxist nationalist writing of the 60s and 70s, that India's past was not a past where change did not happen. They tracked a history of change and growth and development within the urban and rural areas. They analyzed the emergence of new forms of government, new forms of state, and analyzed the different forms which were established over a period of time. They looked at how judicial courts, administrative systems, modes of government were established, things which were not analyzed and understood by the colonial official scholars of the earlier period. Ancient and medieval India became a period of dynamism, of vibrancy, of growth, of expansion, of development, of state making, of reordering of social orders. So this was a dynamic, the picture of the past became a picture of dynamism and innovation. Now this led to a new generation of historians writing new histories. This was not just Bipin Chandra, Romila, Thapar, Irfan Habib and others who wrote that history. Their students, their colleagues and others, the History Congress, all of them were involved in the rethinking of Indian history in the 60s and 70s. It is at this time that they write their textbooks. And the textbooks in many different ways, actually in a distilled form, it is not a compression, simplification of the texts of the scholars in the academic books, but they tried to think of many different ways that new current cutting edge knowledge could be actually written about for students in a way that they could understand, in a way that teachers could understand. Now, therefore, revision is something which is dynamic. It leads to new ways of thinking and encourage and inspires a new generation of historical work. This kind of change we see not just in India, obviously, you see all over the world. When E.P. Thompson, for instance, one of the finest historians of our time, wrote that famous line in his own textbook, in his book on making of the English working class, he wrote, "I'm seeking to rescue the poor stocking girl, the Luddite copper, the obsolete handloom weaver, the utopian artisan, and even the deluded follower of Joanna Southcott from the enormous condescension of posterity." Now, this is a call for a new kind of history. This is a call for writing of a history of forgotten people, a call for the writing of history of small people, of marginalized, of not just the workers, but the commoners and the peasants and the small artisans who lived in the areas, but their histories are not being written. So this inspires a new generation of historians to write history from below. What would history look like from the perceptions of people who are down there? Not from the perceptions of the people who dominate and control states and society, but from the points of view of the marginal groups within society. By the 1870s, 1970s and 80s, we have other kinds of shifts taking place within history writing, other kinds of revisions which are taking place. Gender history becomes very important. Feminist historians remind us that history till now has been male-centric. It's patriarchal, it's male-centric, it focuses on the activities and agency of men rather than the women. And this leads to a new generation of historians who are conscious of the problem of male-centric histories, and they bring women into history not by adding women to existing histories, but by rethinking of history in a way where men and women both are active participants in the making of history. So there is a whole range of revisions which take place, which we see as generative, which inspires new ways of thinking and writing and looking. And this is something which we have to be conscious of. So therefore, revision, when we talk about revision of history, it doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's a productive thing. It is generative and leads to transformation of history writing in many different ways. But not all revisions are generative. They can be, I would argue, be so profoundly ideological and they can be driven by ideas which are anti-scholarly, which are opposed to academic research. In many ways, they are not something which is inspired by intellectual curiosity and intellectual developments in the field, but they are ideologically driven. So this is the kind of history which is anti-scholarly, anti-intellectual, anti-academic, which stultifies thinking and which I see as in many ways undesirable and does not lead to productive changes within historical writing. So to talk about the process that we were involved in, in 2006 to 8, in rewriting the new history that was written of the time, I'll begin with the process itself. It was in 2006 that some of us were asked to rewrite the history textbooks of the time. We were both excited and anxious. We were anxious because the existing textbooks, the earlier textbooks which at that time existed in India, were written by our teachers and mentors, Romila, Bipin, and established historians like Irfan, Satish Chandra, R.S. Sharma. They were the doyens in their field and they dominated history, the historical thinking in the 1960s, 70s, 80s and 90s. Therefore, and their textbooks they had written were extremely good books of the time in the 70s and 80s, 60s, 70s and 80s, and we all read it as students. I still remember that the school textbook which came out in 72, 73, Bipin Chandra's textbook, was, I was in St. Stephen's at the time, and I was told to read it even in my third year. Robi Chatterjee, who used to teach us, he says, yes, you have read all the other scholars in the field, but if you want a textbook, just read this. It's Bhattacharya. It was very interesting, very important, very exciting. It opened a new way of looking at history. Because earlier, in school, I was reading Vention Smith, R.C. Majumdar, Datta, and others. And this was a completely different kind of a textbook. So we were, therefore, to replace textbooks which we admired and were written by mentors and teachers who are also our friends. Therefore, there was obvious apprehension, anxiety, and a certain sense of fear also. But we were excited in many different ways. We were excited because it gave us the opportunity to try out new ideas that we have been reading about within education, and about the textbooks that we have been reading, which were being published from all over the world. We had seen these textbooks coming out from South Africa, from England, from America, and other places, and they offered us a format and of looking at textbooks which it seemed to us exciting, interesting, and innovative. Educationists at that time were also asking all of us to re-look at children's education in a new way. They were telling us repeatedly that children are curious learners, and this curiosity of children have to be tapped in order to write textbooks, in order to be creative about textbook writing. Children are also active learners. They interpret things, see things in their own way, they innovate, they make sense. They are not passive recipients of knowledge which is given out to them through textbook. So therefore tap that innovative, creative impulse within them. And children also don't learn only through words, they learn through images. So we need to bring in images within the text in creative ways so that we can nurture their desire for new knowledge, not just nurture their desire for new knowledge, but we can help them think through images about the past. So when the textbook, when we were asked to write the textbook, we had to think of the ways in which we could proceed. In 2004 and 5, when the process really began, first we had to devise the syllabus. This took over a year for us to discuss, because we were trying to shift the structure of syllabus completely from an earlier structure to a new way of thinking. We needed to acknowledge whatever was there, the knowledge of the past which you could see within the textbooks of the time, but we wanted to subsume that and develop it in ways which was a departure from the existing established kind of ways of thinking about textbooks. A small group of us, historians, teachers, educationists, and activists, NGO activists, Ekalavya, people who were there in Ekalavya, we unpacked the earlier structures of textbooks. We scrutinized the existing textbooks, thinking of the structure that could be developed to write the new textbooks. And this was a time in NCERT which was there was a vibrant intellectual atmosphere where all the textbooks were being written, and therefore we were interacting actively with the sociologists, with the anthropologists, with the people in writing the textbooks on Hindi and English English. We were interacting with those who were writing the maths textbooks and exchanging ideas about how to proceed. And in doing the textbooks, we thought of we thought of a series of turns that sorry, it slipped. We were thinking of a series of shifts we needed to make. I'll talk about 4 shifts that we were making, which in some ways was a shift away from the existing structures of textbooks. First, we had to decide whose history is worth knowing. In defining this, we had to expand our focus of historical revision. In the 1960s and 70s all over the world, before the 1970s, 50s and 60s and 70s, on a history which is made by heroes, on a history, this is important because we are going back to that history now. The history was seen as something which is made by heroes. So the focus is on heroic history of heroic people. The dominant classes and groups was the focus of the study very often. And in India, as well as in England and other places, there was a shift from the dominant classes to the peasants and the workers. But what about the question we asked in the 2005 and 6? But what about the other social groups, apart from the peasants and the workers and the middle classes and the landowners and the zamindars and the industrialists? What about the pastoralists and the forest dwellers, the shifting cultivators and the nomads, the peddlers and the artisans, the Dalits and the aboriginals, the tribals and the mountain dwellers? What about their history? Don't they also have a history which needs to be recognized and written about? And if we integrate that history, how does that transform our framework of knowing and framework of history altogether? It's not a question of adding that history onto what is there already. It is a question of rethinking history altogether. So whose experience? This means we need to decide whose experience is worth recording. Is it the experience of certain kind of groups of people, the dominant and the powerful and the heroic within society, or the ordinary, or the people the small people whose voices cannot be heard? How do we recover that voice, and how do we integrate it within the school textbooks? So we had in the different chapters of the books from class 6 to 12, we had chapters on pastoralists and tribals, on Dalits and artisans, the forest dwellers in India and Indonesia, the pastoralists in Africa and India, the aboriginals of America and Australia, the peasants and farmers in India, UK and US. All these were brought in many different chapters and given a space which they never usually had in earlier textbooks and earlier history writing. So this is the first shift that takes place, which is from the big to the small, from the dominant to the subordinated, marginal and others. The second shift is the shift which is equally important, and again I'm emphasizing this because this is again something which is being given up now. This is the shift to the everyday. The point we were making is that why should shift focus on big events and processes, big political events and big social economic processes? We wanted students to know that the seemingly small things can also tell us a lot about the past. One or two examples that Romila had already given, that everything around us has a history, and can we not integrate that in some way in the writing of history? The clothes we wear, she gave the example of chairs, but the clothes we wear, the food we eat, the games we play, all this has a history. So the seemingly everyday thing has a history which we need to recover and record and give them space within the textbook so that children learn to historicize everything. So we had chapters on the history of cricket, history of sport in class 9. We had a chapter on clothing, how clothes actually can tell us about the history of caste, history of religion, history of community, history of the nation, history of colonization, history of nationalism, and all that read through the history of clothing. We can talk about the history of novels, history of print culture, and we had chapters on the history of the novel, history of print culture, and how all this is important in understanding the world we live in and how this world has emerged from the world of the past. So all this found space in the textbooks that were between 2005 and 7. And the third point was that how do we go beyond a history till now which actually was extremely Eurocentric. That is history which saw development and growth first taking place in Europe, and then that growth and development, the models of the growth and development being reproduced elsewhere, emulated elsewhere, followed elsewhere, and it is in relation to Europe that the entire world acquired meaning. So we wanted to get away from this Eurocentric framework because this was something which was being widely critiqued in the wider world of historiography. And we did this by rethinking class 9 and 10 textbooks where we focused on the history of modernity and the contemporary world, but we brought in the history of India or Vietnam, Japan and Africa all together in writing about the history of the world. That is, if you take a theme like pastoralism, you move from India to Indonesia. You take a theme about peasantry, you move in the same chapter from India to England to America to show how modern developments in agriculture take place, how the history of agriculture can be understood in comparative terms. So this was an attempt to rethink history with its focus, which was earlier on Europe, to a focus which is now not shifted just to India, but sees India, Indonesia, Africa and others as part of the making of the modern world. Bring them together to think about the emergence of modernity. So we see therefore a shift which we were trying to define, which thought about marking a shift from the big to the small, from the great events to the everyday life, from a focus on the West to a focus in a way which brings in the different, which shows how all the countries in very many different ways are part of the making of history itself. And finally, we wanted the students to know how historical knowledge is produced. So we tried to introduce from class 6, 5, 6, 7 onwards sources within the textbooks and interaction with the sources through questions, etc., so that children know the kind of sources which are there. But in class 12, the entire textbook of class 12 was devised around sources, that each chapter actually focused on a source to read history through that source, bringing in other sources but talking of the problems of that source. We moved from inscriptions and archaeology to chronicles and epics, to oral history, to police records, from newspapers to novels. All these things were seen as sources which historians and students must understand as valid and authentic sources of the writing of history, and what are the problems and potential in doing history through these sources. All that was being brought in some way. We also tried to make the history gender sensitive, a point we tried to make, sensitive to ecological issues, that is development and modernity, and the history of development and growth also has ecological implication. It's an implication we need to understand. It doesn't lead to progress alone, it leads to problems too. And those are the problems which it sought to point to. But this is the kind of change and development that we focused on, and which were there part of the textbooks of the time. But in the last 10 years, a different kind of a shift and change has come about. I'll talk a little about that. To wrap up the argument about the problematic and the generative frameworks that I was talking about. In the last 10 years, we see two processes of change. One is the censorship and editing of books which we had produced between 2006 and 2008. There were large-scale cuts, entire chapters dropped, and modification and changes within the text. I'll just point to a few to show the trend that which was there and to highlight the politics of that trend. First, in terms of the large-scale shift, we see an erasure of the history of Mughals and the Islamic lands. The space devoted to the Muslims or Islamic history continuously contracted over time. In class 12, the chapter on courts and chronicles, which talked of the Mughals, and it was an attempt to explore Mughal history through courts, through the chronicles. That entire chapter was dropped. In class 11, the chapter on Islamic lands, which talked of the importance of the Islamic land. Islamic lands were very often completely neglected out, which is not on India, but on the Islamic lands outside. That chapter was entirely dropped. In class 7, 2 pages given very briefly. In the earlier textbook, Mughal and Sultanate history was treated at length. Now we had of the rulers and their rules and administration, etc. In Satish Chandra's book, if you look at it, it is dealt with in a fair amount of. We reduced all that in order to bring in other kinds of history, but we had given a summary of all the kings and the rulers of the medieval period in 2 pages with pictures, images, and a short note on each. Those 2 pages on the Mughal rulers and the sultanates were dropped. Now, this is one kind of shift which was taking place, which everyone knows about because the newspapers immediately talked about it. But there were many other kinds of changes which were happening, and I'll point to a few of those. What we see throughout is, secondly, that is the second point I'd like to make, is a gradual sanitization of caste histories, a sanitization of the past in a way where the problems of caste hierarchy, the problems of caste oppression, caste marginalization, repression, etc., was gradually eliminated from the existing textbooks which all of us had produced. And this happens in many, many different ways. First, legal, there were court cases against us, which we had to defend. Court case, many court cases, but one of the court cases which was the consequence of petition written, petition where there were about 500 or 600 page produced in order to counter the textbooks. And usually the evidence all came from colonial sources, Eliot Dawson and others in the right colonial officials. When the censorship began, first we were told that what the textbooks are doing is to malign the past. It's presenting Indian past as it is talking of the Hindus and caste system in a way that people, which is problematic within society, and it is in many different ways trying to present Hindu past in a poor light. And gradually, when they started eliminating words and sentences, we had to carefully look at the structure of that elimination, and we found that many changes were so invisible at one level, unless carefully looked at, that you couldn't even see how that actually changed the meaning of what was being said. The shift which took place is that the focus on the lower orders, the marginals, was steadily reduced. In class 6 book, for instance, the discussion on the dasas and dasims were dropped. The references to karmakaras were dropped. In class 7, the chapter on towns, traders and craftsmen was dropped. In chapter 8, weavers, the chapter on weavers, iron smelters and factory owners was dropped. In chapter 9, the chapter on peasants and farmers was dropped. So there is a continuous elimination of anything to do with the poorer people, the lower orders, etc. The third, the history of everyday life, which we try to bring into the history, that is eliminated altogether. In class 9, the history of sport, the story of cricket, that is dropped. In class 9 again, the chapter on clothing is dropped. In class 10, the chapter on novels is dropped. So everyday life does not have to have a history. It is not seen as worth knowing. The history has to be about big things, great people, great actors who did various great things in the past. Fourth, the focus on art and culture is eliminated. We had in class 7 a chapter on rulers and buildings. This is dropped. It is very interesting because this is a chapter, for the first time we had an entire section on the so-called destruction of temples and mosques and other temples and stupas and all. That entire chapter was dropped because it talked not only of Muslims, so-called invaders destroying, but also talked of Hindu rulers destroying Buddhist stupas and invading and taking over images and artifacts from other places, Buddhist places. The anomalous thing was the elimination of urban history from all the textbooks. There are 2 chapters on urban history, both were dropped. And the reason for that is something which we can speculate why this is being done. But gradually the history is in eliminating in the censorship, the project of censorship, we see elimination of everyday history, elimination of a focus on the lower caste, and elimination of art and architecture, histories of art and architecture, and of increasing focus on dynastic history, which is something which we see in the new textbooks which have now been introduced. I'll make just 2 or 3 points on the new textbooks and end up. Is that? Sorry. On the new textbooks, I just will make 3 points. One, we see definitive return to dynastic histories. There is a return to old dynastic history which we have transcended, which we have critiqued, and a celebration of great Hindu dynasties. The Mauryas, the Guptas, the Cholas, the Cheras, the Pandyas, the Shakas, the Sungas, the Satavahanas, the Kushanas, etc., etc. Second, we return to the idea of the glorious age of the ancient glorious age of the Hindus and the dark age of the Mughals. And the most interesting, and this is something which we have critiqued long back, that no age is uniformly dark, no age is uniformly glorious. Every age has changes and developments we can appreciate and talk about, and other changes which we may critique. So darkness cannot be mapped onto an age, nor can a period be entirely seen as wonderful. In many ways, in talking about darkness and glorious age, they were taking over colonial frameworks of thought, Mill's idea of the dark age and Orientalist idea of the glorious age. What is interesting is that the textbooks choose to do this, the argument of dark age, by attacking Akbar. I can come back to that later. Akbar, who is uniformly seen, very widely seen as a ruler who tried to accommodate different kinds of religions and communities and classes to build a new moral order, a new order of ethical and moral rule, is shown as a brutal and cruel king. His attack on Chittor, where many thousands were killed, and which is recognized by everyone, that is seen as evidence of his brutality and cruelty, and the fact that he shifted from that early phase to a more mature phase of ethical kingship, where Sulekul became important, and he attempted to integrate the Rajputs and others through Mansabdari system, marriages and various other forms, that is entirely overlooked. And interestingly, this is a contrast to the way Ashoka is very often seen as. He also, after the Kalinga War, he shifts and changes and begins to talk about non-violence and Dhamma, etc., etc. But in the case of Akbar, that shift is not really focused upon. Third, what we see in this change is an attempt to project back present-day ideas of democracy back into the past and reinterpret institutional structures like sabhas and samitis as democratic institutions, which again is something which has been debated and rejected long time back. And we have to ask the question, can present-day ideas be so easily projected back into the past? And finally, history is seen as a history of great men. And history is seen as a history which has to be written to infuse the students with pride in the nation. But what we need to ask is, what is it that is to inspire that pride? Are we to do it through a glorification of the problematic glorification of the past by focusing on great kings and their great deeds? Or are we to do that through a more through an analysis and understanding of the development and growth of society in its more complex ways, where the good and the bad are both looked at and therefore talked about in ways which is historically defensible in many senses. Finally, we find that in all the textbooks there is an effort to create a sense of sacred, the relationship between the people, students, to a sacred land. Sacred geography of India is what constantly one talks of, and the unity of India is something which is being talked of. The diversity is incorporated in the unity. There is only one unity which is reflected in many different forms. Therefore, unity is not produced through a complex relationship between diverse groups and social elements and traditions and influences within society, but the unity is given. The unity can only reappears in different forms as manifestation of the diverse, whose source is the unity. We can have two different notions of unity here. One, the diverse interact to constitute a complex unity. The other, there is a simple unity which takes on different forms. That is the Hindu unity, I think, which is being talked of within the textbooks. I'll stop there.